Vaghi is the director of web here at Fuzz. He has very graciously volunteered to give a presentation on the topic of designing API-driven components that scale, and he'll explain exactly what that means. So take it away, John Vaghi.
Yeah, how's it going? This isn't the presentation, but I wanted to show that I thought this was a fun site. Remember when sites look like this? There's just a bunch of GIFs. Anyway, if you go to this website, it's a fun experience. It's like the olden days of web design. We've come a long way, or we've regressed, depending on how you look at this. But what I want to talk about, well, first of all, my name is John, as Leonard said. I am not a designer, I'm a programmer. I don't know if anybody gets this reference. Brooklyn Nine-Nine. So at the end of Brooklyn Nine-Nine, there's this really charming moment where this guy says, "Shh, not a doctor," so not a designer. But yeah, see, one word, you got it. So I really struggled with the title of this presentation. Responsive API-driven components at scale kind of sounded pretty good. It's kind of about that. Somebody else suggested I call it atomic design for big data, kind of taking advantage of marketing buzzwords. I was going to go on a rant about grid systems and how much I hate them, but we're not going to do that. I appreciate that you're all designers. I am not, so the lighting is completely all over the place in this presentation, so I apologize about that. And this title was actually suggested by our Android director, Leonard. Thank you, Leonard. And this kind of gets at the heart of what I want to talk about. Size matters, and when I talk about size, I'm talking about device width, screen size, and also content size. That is a key component to this presentation. And kind of the goal is to create kind of a mindset and a context of thinking that allows you to ensure that the apps that you're designing and the apps that a developer is building never feel broken, which is kind of a negative way of phrasing it. So kind of a better way of phrasing it is ensuring our apps always feel considered. And to kind of set some foundation for what I'm going to talk about, this is the first website I ever worked on. This was back in 2008. Somebody was really into Boston and gave walking tours of historic Boston. And when he wanted to make updates to the site, he needed to go through a team of PM, developer, designer, in order to make any content updates, right? So he really couldn't break anything. If he wanted to throw crazy stuff at the website, there was always kind of a team in place to, a team of aesthetic warriors to ensure that the content that he was changing always looked good when it was actually deployed, right? Today, sites are a little more dynamic. There are a lot more data points. A lot more of the content is dynamic. You have all sorts of integrations. The content doesn't have that wall of defense anymore. You have user-generated content. You have client updating content directly on the site via a CMS. You have all these APIs, the integration points. You have all sorts of things coming at your website, and you have no real control over what data actually appears on your site. So we kind of have this distinction between, the old days where sites were way more static to today where sites are some combination of being dynamic and static. And it presents a lot of developer problems. API integrations pose their own problems. It probably causes a lot of design problems. I would imagine, how do I design something when I don't necessarily know what the content is going to be? But there's this kind of middle gray area where these more kind of vague problems occur. It's like a light green area. I don't really know what color that is. There's the opening monologue from the Twilight Zone. You unlock this door with the key of imagination. People remember the Twilight Zone, right? Beyond it is another dimension, a dimension of sound, a dimension of sight. I like this phrase, so I'm going to call this the dimension of sight problems. So what do I mean by that? We're going to go through some examples. I was originally calling them exercises, hence Richard Simmons. They're more examples than exercises, but I kept them in there because he just looks really happy. and I'm going to use this site we built, Potbelly. We launched a site a little over a year ago. It's a responsive web app. It lets you order sandwiches for pickup and delivery. And at a high level, here's how you can kind of break down the main components that create the layout, the responsive layout of the site. And all of those components in and of themselves contain both dynamic and static content. So if we take a look at one of the components, we're going to drill down a bit. Here's the header, right? And here's how the header responds. At desktop, you see everything. At tablet mode, the spacing tightens up, the font size gets smaller. These little like sunbursts go away. And then at mobile, everything collapses into the hamburger, right? So we're very good at this. We do responsive. Responsive has a lot of paradigms that are well established, and I think from a design standpoint and a developer standpoint, the paradigms make a lot of sense. That's responsive, that's screen size, that's the first kind of dimension. But what about the dimension of content? So what do we do about the content, the text in the nav itself? How does that scale? So the first thing we have to ask ourselves, and this is probably the most important part, or this is the most important piece of content of this presentation, asking yourself the question for every component, which of the content is dynamic? Where is the content coming from? So for the sake of this nav, let's just say it's all static, right? Everything is static. Everything that the client wants to change will have to go through, a wall of fuzz in order to update, thus ensuring that it will always look good, right? So we're good. Like, we have no problems. We have our responsive design, but not so fast, because this is the logged out state, right? When you log in, what happens? Anybody? Your name, yes. So the sign-in state, wait, who said that? Is it David? Good job. Oh, wasn't he? Sorry, no credit. Yeah, so your name appears, yeah. It seems super, yeah, your first name, hi, John. Super nice, like, not a problem probably, right? Like we all will see this and be like, yeah, that makes a lot of sense, let's do that. But it introduces this one small piece of dynamic content to this component, which for the most part seems pretty innocuous. But what it does is it kind of changes the navigation from something that's predictable to something that's unpredictable. And what I mean by that is, in this kind of static, predictable model, we always know how much space is going to exist between the left-aligned content and the right-aligned content. And we can build the nav such that we can ensure that those two pieces of content never overlap one another until you reach mobile and it collapses, right? All very easy to handle from a developer standpoint. Now that we have this unpredictable model, we have some more problems. Thus, we can't always ensure that we don't always know what the spacing between the left-aligned content and the right-aligned content is going to be. If my name is John, this works great responsibly. If my name is Jonas, oh, thank God, yeah, I was hoping something. Yeah, he's on the Bucks. He was the longest name I could think of. That wasn't a made-up name. So if you're using some small tablet, you have this one, right? Yeah, the text starts overlapping, you have a problem, your app feels broken, no longer feels considered, and this is kind of what we want to solve for. So how do we solve this? Another question I like to ask is, what restrictions exist on the dynamic content? In this case, I don't think any restrictions exist. I think your name can be, I think Potbelly lets you have your name be any number of characters. I should probably know this, but I don't. For the sake of this argument, we could say it limits your name to only being 20 characters. Thus, you as a designer, me as a developer, would have to account for worst case scenario, somebody whose name is 20 W's in a row, right? We're not using monospace fonts. So the widest character I think is W, your name is 20 capital W's, that's worst case scenario. So you would have to build something that would account for somebody whose name is literally the letter I, from there to somebody whose name is 20 W's in a row. And that kind of gets us there. Somebody whose name is 20 W's in a row will still probably conflict in our small tablet state. So we have to make some additional concessions. We have to think about this a little harder. This 20 character restriction probably is not going to help us too much from a design developer standpoint. So the third question we kind of ask ourselves is, how am I willing to compromise? Which sounds negative, but what I mean by that is, what can we do to the content that is a little bit different than the original design to accommodate this unpredictability in the text, in the content? So one tactic is you can truncate the name, you can break the name at a certain point, you can make the name smaller, and this kind of works too. And these are all fine, and some combination of these will probably work. Some combination of these across some combination of breakpoints will probably work. But what it does, what this dynamic content has done, is it has introduced additional compromises. So remember, here's our responsive breakpoints. We have 3 states, and this is everything. The tablet view we've compromised. I say compromised, I don't really know what else to call it, but we've compromised the font size, we've made it smaller, we've compromised the spacing, we've made it less. We've compromised the aesthetic of this order now CTA, we removed the sunbursts. In the signed in state, we have 2 additional compromises. In order to make this work, we had to get rid of the sign out button at this size. And then what did we do here? We just got rid of the name entirely on the smaller tablet. Now, what are we saying here? This isn't to say that somebody who's using a tablet never wants to sign out of the website, right? Like, that's probably not something that happened during our discussions. But these are kind of the things that we have to think about. And these are conversations that do require both dev and design input. What is the best thing that we can do in this kind of smaller tablet mode to ensure that the experience isn't compromised and the kind of main point of our aesthetic, I guess, persists, while acknowledging that we can't support, everything. We can't support every possible situation. So what do? We remove some content, we remove more content. The experience is degraded slightly for some probably smaller subsection of the users. Are we okay with that? And again, the point of this is very much a design and dev collaboration. That's why I kind of have identified it as that overlap between design and dev. And was this the right way to solve this problem? I don't know. It's one of the ways to solve the problem. There's probably others, but this is the thing that keeps me up at night. There's somebody on this device who's like, what's my name? I keep forgetting. And that's not even, and yeah, so that, again, so that's just one example of how one piece of dynamic content that at first seems kind of innocuous can add these additional layers of complexity and dimension to a component of a website. It's not to mention, we haven't even talked about the fact that when you add items to your cart, that big, wide order now button becomes a very small bag with a dynamic count. Now you have more space on the left. Do you do anything with that? And that's just kind of a whole other thing. We won't get into that, but we will do one more example / exercise. This is Richard Simmons. Now he's upside down, so he's, I guess, frowning? I don't know. But so here's our site again. There are the components. We're going to take a look at this one. This is the category submenu, or the menu category tab. And it looks simple, like we do this all the time. This is just a list of menu categories. And it looks simple enough, right? You as a developer or a designer, you could build this in a couple of minutes, as long as it looks exactly like this. But when you ask yourself those first two questions, what content is dynamic? Well, in this case, all of the content is dynamic. Everything comes from an API. We don't know what it's going to be. We don't even know if it's going to exist at all. What restrictions exist? None. Potbelly could have 1,000 categories. It could have one category. You could have one category that has 1,000 characters in it. Yeah, so here's what we do. 9 categories, 10 categories, 1 category, and everything in between. So what do we do in this case? Well, this is a question I like to ask myself. I don't know if other devs ask themselves this, or if anybody else asks themselves this question, but I like asking, what's a reasonable worst thing that can happen? And what I mean by that is, Potbelly is probably not going to have 100 categories, and there's probably not going to be a category with 1,000 characters. If that does happen, then Potbelly has bigger problems. Somebody on their side probably messed some stuff up. Or if they literally have changed their menu to have 1,000 categories now, that's a new design thing that we have to account. We have to just redesign that whole thing, right? Like the thing that we envision working for this will no longer work. So there's kind of this isn't a very scientific graph. I don't even know if it's really a graph. I don't know what it is, it's just kind of a line. But there's kind of this middle ground between, in this case, not having any content at all, which is unlikely, and having way too much content, which is also unlikely. And then there's kind of what we're responsible for. There's some flexibility we have to build into this component that can support not 1,000 categories, but maybe like 12 categories, maybe down to 6 categories. And such, the design has to be something that can look good with 6 categories and 12 categories. And the developer has to build it such that it doesn't only work with just those 9 categories, it should also scale to work with 12 categories or 6 categories. And again, this is kind of a collaborative process. Because what do we compromise? How do we compromise when there are more categories, or there are less categories, or there are categories with longer or shorter names? The obvious one is spacing. As there's more categories, there's less spacing between, what are they called? The categories? Font size. As the screen size gets smaller, the font size. And that's more of a responsive thing, but that's another compromise in this case. The main question, I think, and the most interesting part of this component specifically was, how do we compromise on the potential of overflow? So at some point you do run out of horizontal space. At some point there will be no spacing between categories left. So what do? 2 obvious options. You could either break the content onto a second row, a third row, a fourth row, depending on how many categories you have, or you could just have it overflow horizontally and have like a kind of horizontal scroll thing built in. And both options are kind of viable, which leads us to, I think, the last question. And this should really say technical and usability implications, but you should ask yourself what the technical and usability implications are of both approaches. In this first case, it could take a developer 30 seconds to implement that, but from a usability standpoint, be 100 times worse. I made that number up, but that's one example. Whereas this one could be a much better user experience, but take 6 hours to do. Which one is worth doing? I don't know if there's not. Maybe I'm missing it. I don't know if there's an obvious answer to this choice. It probably depends on timeline, budget. It depends on a lot of factors. In this case, I would say this is probably what I would aim for if there was time. But then there's also another kind of dimension of this, which is, well, how likely is this to actually happen? How many users would actually potentially be affected by this? If Potbelly hasn't changed their menu in 100 years, do we really have to support 40 categories? Do we really need to care that much if this does happen? How much should we care about it? How much time should we invest in this situation that might never happen, probably won't ever happen? And these are the kind of, I think, conversations that, frankly, are fun to have. I enjoy kind of negotiating with designers about how to do this thing, because if I'm left up to usually the developer will do something that incurs the least amount of technical debt, which usually means it's the easiest thing for them to do, which usually means it's the worst thing from a usability standpoint. I'm generalizing a lot, but you definitely don't want to leave it up to the developer. So you as a designer should step in and be proactive about, or both parties should be proactive about having this conversation. But I do think it's an interesting question, because I could rationalize it either way. And there's a lot of different factors that go into how to solve this problem, and even if it's a problem worth solving. I think the main takeaway from this is it should scale somehow. Somehow it should scale. The content shouldn't bleed into the content below it. Again, we don't want text overlapping. We don't want it to look broken. This doesn't look broken. It looks silly, but not broken. this, if it's wipeable, again, it looks probably better, but not broken. And that's kind of what we're going for. Because remember, it's all about having that conversation. And these 5 questions are questions that, you know, probably the whole project team should ask themselves. It'd be a fun exercise maybe to go through a site, break it down by component, and then ask all 5 questions about each component. And things are going to come up, like you can't hash out all of these things in the design phase. Things are going to come up in dev, things are going to come up in QA that will constantly force you to revisit and go through these questions. You don't catch everything the first time. I've been very naive. I've nodded and been like, oh yes, that design looks fine. And then like 2 weeks later when I'm building it, I've been like, oh my God, why are they doing this to me? So yeah, I mean, there's no way to catch it all at the beginning, but I think just like remembering to ask yourself these questions as throughout the whole project, I think is a very valuable thing. Because while these problems still need to be solved, this overlap is, in my opinion, is an opportunity for dev and design to collaborate in really rewarding ways, hash things out, negotiate the muddy and fraught waters between what's ideal and what's practical. And there are a lot of things that are going on in this overlap. The dimensions of site are vast. Differing screen sizes, pixel densities, all sorts of varying content counts and lengths and sizes, content that may or may not even exist. But it's all towards the same end goal, which is to ensure our apps always feel considered. Oh shit. Or if you want to, wow. Or if you want to kind of bring it all full circle, because size matters, then design should align such that responsive API-driven components always feel considered. And that, yeah, I guess that's it. So, are there any questions, comments, concerns, frustrations? Leonard has a question. Not that one.
Second one.
Does
Why
anyone?
don't you just make the logo small? The potbelly.
Yeah, I think that, yeah, it's a good
Yeah, why
Clients are like that.
When has a client ever wanted to make the logo smaller?
I get that. That seemed quite obvious, just to make the logo smaller.
Yeah, well, but it would buy you, yeah, there are certain things, that would have bought you like, you know, X amount of pixels at a certain point. You know, you could solve it. You could solve it at tablet. You could probably make it smaller on tablet without the client. The other thing is you do these things kind of behind the scenes without the client really noticing, right? Like, you don't go through all of this with the client necessarily, because it is kind of a lot, and there are a lot of different dimensions. I do think, you know, if you were to just arbitrarily make the logo smaller on desktop to support a longer name, that doesn't feel like the best thing to do.
No, not necessarily arbitrary, just make the logo smaller.
It's a strategic decision to make it
Yeah,
logo
you could have made the logo smaller. Yeah, I could have bought you some pixels. It is kind of a battle. Yeah, you're fighting very pixel for sure.
Yeah.
I don't know if anybody has waged that war before, but it's very.
So,
It takes a lot of victims. There are a lot of casualties in the war.
so is this always a conversation that should happen after you see the initial design, or do you expect the designer to just come to you with like scenario 1, scenario 2, scenario 3?
Yeah, that's a good question, because one of the things that I did not do in this was I didn't give any kind of tangible tactics by which to achieve any of this, because I'm not sure. I think a lot of the times what I find is that I'm solving these problems during development, and I'm frustrated with myself for not having kind of figured this out before the designs kind of got approved. Like, I wish I had asked myself those questions during the design review so that I could have identified the things that were going to frustrate me later on. So I do think that they don't need to be, I think, necessarily solved before design happens, but ideally as many would be solved as possible before dev happens. The other thing you could do that I was thinking about was, you know, kind of acknowledge the ambiguity of the content by instead of designing. So instead of having a, you know, in this case, in this case, having the actual category names, having like lorem ipsum or some placeholder text for the internal review. The client always gets confused with lorem ipsum, so don't show it to the client. But if you have lorem ipsum for internal reviews, then at least it kind of draws attention to the fact that these components are dynamic and require some additional conversation, right? So that's one thing that can help.
What about, would the client tell you which categories are prioritized? And like after, like if 7 categories are prioritized, you would add like more dots or like a link to show more menu items?
Yeah, these are all, yeah, I mean, again, this is why it's hard to kind of give like general rules of thumb from a design standpoint for this, because a lot of it is kind of contextual. In this case, the client updates the menu in a system that informs both the app and the website and basically their whole kind of infrastructure. So they're kind of making those updates independently of the website to some extent, and there's no real sense of priority. They kind of order it how they want it. I guess they could order it differently on their end, but you would have something like a show more, but you're saying like a show more button or like a show hide.
Yeah, or being able to set, if you have a CMS, like making it so that they can set which items like definitely have to show and which
right.
hidden.
Yeah, and that's a great point too. From like if you are designing this in kind of parallel with a CMS, if you kind of identify this as a problem as you're initially designing it, you'll probably then identify the need for some kind of prioritization mechanism in the CMS, which you may have overlooked had you not kind of seen this as a problem initially. Like you could have launched it without a prioritization mechanism, and then you would have run into this problem and been like, oh crap, our CMS needs some way to prioritize these, right? So again, kind of getting ahead of that helps you solve that problem initially. Kind of the main goal is being proactive about all of this as much as you can.
Yeah, do you think for tangible tactics, what some kind of checklist that the whole team kind of considers? So like, this is dynamic content, this is what we should check for, might be a good way to solve that. There's checklists that are used in like aviation and in medicine and stuff that serve as good reminders for stuff like that. Maybe that might be a way to go. As long as the whole team kind of considers it and kind of agrees upon what might be the right steps.
Yeah, for sure. And yeah, I think that's a good idea. And I think, yeah, again, like the alignment of all parties is important because, you know, the designers typically fight for the best aesthetic and usable experience. The dev will probably fight for the easiest thing to do on their side. And the PM will probably have like a different perspective, which is what does the client kind of want? What are the like analytics around this in terms of usage and how does this affect the timeline and the budget? So it's kind of like the actual approach should be like some combination of all of those factors, which again are very contextual. There's no like one design rule that should necessarily inform the answer to all of these questions and be the be all end all rule. It should be kind of like derived from like all of those factors that the PM and the dev and the designer all have to weigh in on, because that's all their different perspectives.
So would you then update Q5 to basically include the business aspect of it? Because before we were talking about technical.
Yeah, I definitely missed a couple of that. I think this one gets out of the best. Like you have the developer being like, this is the easiest way to go. You have the designer being like, well, this is the best experience. And you have the PM or business person being like, well, you know, this is never going to happen, or this doesn't affect anybody, or, you know, like, so yeah, there's that third kind of dynamic that isn't design or dev, I guess it's more business, which wasn't touched on, or wasn't encompassed in this presentation, but is definitely something that needs to be considered when going over this kind of stuff.
Well, on that note, let's take a break. Please continue the conversation. I think everyone has tons of questions on this topic. Go refill your drink, finish all the pizza, and come back in like 5 minutes for the second speaker.